Moin and Guten Tag. Today we are making an amazing no-knead sourdough bread in just 7 easy to follow steps. Before getting started, let me show you what you can expect by following my recipe. My goal was to develop a recipe that you can easily follow. We will start this video with some crucial background information and then get started making this beauty. I've also added chapters to this video. That way you can also just jump ahead to the chapters that interest you. This recipe assumes that you already have a sourdough starter. If you don't, no worries, then please check out this video where I show you exactly how to make a super active and healthy sourdough starter. Now, with a no-knead recipe, fermentation is king. Fermentation is the process where tiny microorganisms convert your flour and water mixture into something incredibly delicious. And this process you have to master. It's 80% of baking an amazing sourdough bread. And for a no-knead bread recipe, mastering the fermentation process is even more important. But no worries, I got you covered. I'll show you exactly how to do this. For this video, I'm assuming that you want to bake a delicious bread Saturday morning. Now, the process for baking this actual recipe starts on Wednesday. But don't worry, it's pretty much just mostly waiting. Since fermentation is so important, we will be readying our starter on Wednesday. Then we will be giving it a couple of feedings. And then on Thursday evening, we're setting up our main dough. We're then going to proof our bread shortly at room temperature, and then we will transfer the bread to the fridge for an overnight proof. We will be baking it on Saturday morning. Perfect for a delicious breakfast. But don't worry, it's pretty much just waiting. Actual time spent working on this recipe is probably around 10 to 15 minutes, depending on how much experience you have. Okay, enough background information. Let's get started with our 7 steps to make this delicious sourdough bread. Step number 1, preparing your sourdough starter. Your sourdough starter is the single most important ingredient of this recipe. You need to have a healthy starter that is not too acidic. Acid results in over-fermentation and likely very flat bread. With too much acid, your bread can't hold its structure anymore and it's just going to collapse. This is the number 1 mistake I see beginners doing. But don't worry, I got you covered. I'll show you exactly what you have to do. That's why we start feeding our sourdough on Wednesday morning by removing it from the fridge. We will be applying 1 to 5 feedings on Wednesday and on Thursday. That's 10 grams of sourdough starter, 50 grams of water, and 50 grams of flour. So on Wednesday morning, remove your sourdough starter from the fridge and give it a 1 to 5 feeding. You should notice that it starts to become a little bit active, but likely you're not going to see that much size increase with your starter. On Wednesday evening, we will be doing exactly the same thing one more time. On Thursday morning, you should see that your sourdough starter is already way more active than it was prior to the last feeding. You'll pile up a lot of discard starter, but no worries, this is something incredibly delicious. You can make crackers out of this. You can make a nice sourdough discard bread out of this. I'll be sharing some more links in the description of the video. On Thursday morning, we will be repeating exactly the same process. And then on Thursday evening, your sourdough starter should already be looking pretty good. The yeast and the bacteria of your sourdough are now in a good ratio. And we will be giving this one last feeding overnight and then start making our main dough on Friday morning. So yes, one last 1 to 5 feeding over Thursday night, and then on Friday morning we're ready. I know this sounds like a lot, but this is super important. When not kneading, we need to make sure that our fermentation process is exactly on point. And those steps will get you there. That brings us to step number 2, main dough autolysis. Autolysis, that's a very fancy word for just mixing flour and water. Autolysis is going to start breaking down your flour, making it easier for your sourdough to ferment. Furthermore, it also creates a lot of dough strength simply by waiting. Amazing! And this is exactly what we want for this no-knead bread recipe because we want to be as lazy as possible. So that means for you, on Thursday evening, mix 500 grams of flour with X amount of water.
And then you just mix everything together using your hands for roughly 2 minutes. This is how the dough looked at the start and then in the end.
Now the X, that's very important to understand. The X depends on how much protein your flour has. The protein, out of which 80% is gluten for wheat, is responsible for absorbing a lot of water. I would recommend you to use a strong bread flour, something ideally with a higher protein amount. In general, higher protein quantities are linked to more sun that the wheat had. If you don't have a flour like this, you could of course also be mixing some vital wheat gluten into your flour. Gluten is very important because the more gluten you have, the longer you can ferment your bread. And this means you can inflate your bread more. And by inflating our dough, we will get more oven spring. So we'll have a nicer bread in the end. Now, one thing to understand about gluten is that over the time of this fermentation process, the bacteria inside of your sourdough starts to break down the gluten. This is because the bacteria is producing lactic and acetic acid. And that's why you run into over-fermentation at some point when all your gluten has been damaged. Okay, back to the recipe. In this case, the X for me is 70%. That's because my flour has around 15% protein. So in this case, I would be using 350 grams of water for 500 grams of flour. Now don't be confused by the percentages. That's what bakers like to do. They call this baker's math. This way you can easily scale up the recipe to 2 breads, 3 breads, whatever. All you have to do is recalculate the percentages and you know exactly how many of the other ingredients you have to mix in. So master this recipe and then it's time to open up your own bakery. Step number 3, mixing together the main ingredients. We autolysed our dough overnight and we readied our starter again. And now on Friday morning, it's time to put everything together. In this case, I'm not a regular German, I'm a lazy German, so I'll be doing that at 8 a.m. or 9 a.m. on Friday morning. Test your flour-water mixture. You should be able to get somewhat of a window pane effect. That's very important. That shows that our gluten has developed by simply waiting. If not, you likely have used too much water for your flour. You could be adding some more flour, that's totally okay. And next up, we will be incorporating everything, also adding the salt, because we added no salt yet. For the salt, I'm always using 2% based on the flour. In this case, for 500 grams, that would be 10 grams of salt. I will be using 100 grams of starter for this recipe, that's 20%. We will be mixing everything together for around 2 minutes until we see that there are no sourdough spots left anymore. We want to make sure that we have an evenly homogenized dough so that fermentation can happen everywhere inside of the dough. Now, if you at this stage added additional flour, then bye-bye, you have to knead. You can no longer use this no-knead approach. Just start kneading for around 10 minutes and you should be good as well. And make sure to take note, next time you can correct your mistake. That brings us to step number 4, extracting a fermentation sample. Once we homogenize our mixture, we will be extracting this sample. The main fermentation process has now begun in our dough since we added the starter. The yeast and bacteria now have a delicious feast. By using this sample, we know exactly when we're done with the fermentation of our dough. This makes it very, very, very easy. I previously built a small table that shows you for how long you should ferment depending on your room temperature and depending on the amount of starter that you are using. This table is just a ballpark figure. Unfortunately, it's never 100% correct, but this sample hack, that always makes you ferment exactly on time. That's why I love doing this. Now, the amount of size increase, again, depends on the gluten that you have inside of your dough. So the higher the protein amount, the more you can inflate your dough. For this, I built a small table to just show you a couple of ballpark figures so that you can orient yourself. In my case, my dough has roughly 15% protein, and that's why I'm opting for the doubling in size. Now, the less protein you have, the less you can inflate your dough. So your fermentation is likely going to be a little bit faster than mine. I just use a small glass jar. It should be of cylindric shape, and then just place as much dough inside as is required to cover the jar. I'm a cheap German. I got them when I bought a dessert and I've been using them ever since. I probably have 30 or so of them. After extracting the sample, use your dough scraper or your hands one more time to round up the dough. If it's not nice and smooth, just wait for another 5 minutes and then try again. I'm going to be transferring my dough into a nice glass bowl now, which is excellent for a no-knead bread. Using this glass bowl, I can in the end just flip over the dough. That makes it very easy. Don't worry if you don't have a glass bowl like this, you can use any other container that you have at hand. Just make sure that you can cover it. You don't want your dough to dry out. That brings us to step number 5, shaping the bread. Once our sample has reached the desired size increase, we proceed with this step. In my case, that's around 5 p.m. in the afternoon on Friday. And I made the main dough roughly at 9 a.m. in the morning. If you have issues with sticky dough at this point, you likely have fermented for too long or you use too much water for your flour. Then just consider fermenting a little bit less. Don't go for as much size increase, go for a little bit less. I would also recommend you to just taste a tiny piece of your dough just to get a feeling for the acidity of your dough. Especially when it's too sour, that's typically a sign that you over fermented. And this is the main dough. There's some nice pockets of air, good signs of fermentation. Using a wetted hand, I'm just slowly removing the dough very gently from the edges of the container. Now I'm going to flour the top of the dough. Use a little more, we don't want this dough to stick to the counter. Carefully remove the dough from the container by flipping over the container. If you don't have a container like I have, you should be doing a small stretch and fold, a coil fold ideally, before removing the dough from the container. If you just flip over your container, just wait a little bit, it's going to take a few seconds for the dough to be released from the container. I also asked you on whether one stretch and fold is allowed for a no-knead bread recipe, and you said nope, it's not allowed. But I feel a stretch and fold in the middle of the process would have definitely helped making it easier to remove the dough from the container. But yes, no knead, so no stretch and folds, nothing. The dough just rested until this point. And let me now show you how I carefully shape this bread. A dough scraper is an excellent tool now. I'm just putting some more flour below the dough. So this side is very, very sticky. The bottom side is not because it's floured. And now we just have to fold the dough together, pretty much gluing it together. I'm going to take this side, fold it into the middle, and then I'll glue the other side on top. I'm just brushing off a little bit of that flour because then the dough glues together a little bit better. I'm putting to get below just a little bit more flour because I don't want it to stick. And now I will do the same thing again, just from the other side. And this is our dough now, glued together nicely, nice uniform size. And normally I use a little bit of a different shaping technique, but in this case, since we did not add any dough strength, I actually like this technique quite a lot because it adds more strength. And now I will just roll this dough up. I will take this, push this a little bit outside using my slightly floured hands so it doesn't stick, and then I will roll it up. Now push inside to roll. And here we go, the shaped dough. Now I will seal the edges a little bit. If you have too much flour, it might not work. Then what you can do is you can just brush a tiny little bit of water and then it will be sealed much better. I'm just popping this large pocket of air here because it likely was induced while I shaped the dough. And now this is pretty much our dough. I will use the dough scraper just to tuck it in a little more. Don't overdo it or else you will tear the surface of this dough. With my dough scraper, I'm taking the dough, putting it into my hand, and then I will just place it here inside of the Banneton. Since we didn't need, I will do a little bit of in Banneton stitching. And actually I used too much flour, it doesn't work, so let me just brush this with a little bit of water. So this is now nice and sticky, and I can just take the dough and stitch it over. And this just creates a nice bit of additional strength, making sure that the dough holds its shape. I don't want the dough to stick to the plastic container that I will be using, and that's why I will brush it with some more flour. And we're almost done. Step number 6, proofing our bread. Proofing is the final stage of the fermentation process. It starts after placing our dough inside of the Benetton. And just note, this is the finger poke test. You can see how quickly it expands. If I were to proof this at room temperature the whole time, then I would wait until this dent just slowly recovers. But I will just simply be placing this at room temperature for 30 minutes now, and then we'll go into the fridge for an overnight proof. Cover the dough. We don't want this to dry out, and then it's ready to be baked in the morning. There are many ways to proof, and in fact I have a whole video on this which I recommend you to check out. But in my experience, proofing in the fridge is easiest for beginners. That's because you always have a consistent environment typically. In this case, I want the dough to be ready tomorrow morning at around 9 to 10 a.m. This gives me roughly 18 hours fridge time. Typically you need around 24 hours inside of your fridge at around 4 degrees Celsius. Yeast typically starts to work above 6 degrees Celsius. In my case, the top rack is around 6 degrees Celsius, perfect for proofing this bread. I don't want to go too much into detail, but basically at lower temperatures, the yeast part of your sourdough is more active than the bacterial part. That's exactly what we want to inflate our dough even further. This is very good because this way we do not run into over-fermentation issues that quickly. This is especially amazing when you live in a very warm environment. For roughly the 18 hours, I'm going to be opting for a hybrid strategy. I will just take my bread and place it for 30 minutes on my kitchen counter, and then I will move it to the fridge. The first 30 minutes will inflate your dough a little bit more, and then afterwards the fermentation activity almost comes to a halt when we have our dough inside of the fridge. Very easy, and you can reproduce this on any bake. And this brings us to our last step, step number 7, baking the bread. By now, I hope you're very hungry because you are going to have an amazing bread soon. Get up in the morning on Saturday whenever you want. That's an amazing thing about the fridge. It's very hard to over ferment. You can bake 1 hour later, 2 hours later, 3 hours later. You will not run into big issues. Now, after you get up, preheat your oven for around 30 minutes. You can bake using my cheap German style setup, which I typically use, or you can be opting for a Dutch oven. Yes, we Germans are very cheap. But in this case, I'm just feeling so lazy on Saturday morning, that's why I'll be opting for my Dutch oven. We are going to be baking our dough right out of the fridge. And my Dutch oven and my oven has been preheated for 30 minutes at around 270 degrees Celsius. That's the max my oven can do. For baking, steam is really essential for the first 25 minutes. We will be baking at 230 degrees Celsius. The more steam you have, the better. This way no crust forms and your dough can nicely expand in the oven. Let me repeat that one more time. Steam is everything. Before placing the dough in the oven, we have to score it. That's a fancy word for pretty much just using a razor blade or a knife to slice your dough. Scoring will create a weak spot in the surface of your dough through which the dough will rise while it's baking. It's a little bit hard at the start, but you can definitely try practicing this with a lemon or an apple at home. The cut should be at roughly a 45-degree angle around a centimeter deep. This is another reason why the fridge proofing is amazing, because our dough is now relatively stiff and this makes scoring so much easier. Cut swiftly and don't tear the dough. Then everything goes into the oven and we will be baking this for 25 minutes at 230 degrees Celsius. After 25 minutes, remove your source of steam because now we want our dough to develop that beautiful crispy crust. Then bake for another 15 to 20 minutes. This depends on how dark you like your bread. And if you did everything right, this is how your bread should look like at this point. Well done! What a perfect, beautiful piece of bread. Don't worry, it might take a couple of more attempts, but this is just so incredibly rewarding having this beautiful, delicious sourdough bread. If you have questions, issues, troubleshooting, please drop a comment in the comment section. Now, a logical next step to do is to incorporate a few things like seeds or olives into your dough. We will be doing exactly the same recipe one more time, just adding some olives or seeds, whatever you prefer, into the dough. Thanks again for watching. I hope you learned something new and you had fun. As always, may the gluten be with you.